Hi, we're going to be talking about names in the New Testament in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. What was Jesus' last name? We're actually not given that. Of course, he's called Jesus of Nazareth, also referred to as Son of David, sometimes Messiah, other times Christ. And these could be known by their location, like Jesus of Nazareth, that's the town in which he grew up, or his descent, notice he's called the Son of David, or a title like Messiah or Christ. Messiah, you say it in Hebrew, Christ, you say it in Greek. Um, and that's a title that's given. Now, how about Judas? We have Judas Iscariot to distinguish him from another one of the disciples of Jesus. There were actually two disciples by the name of Judas. It was a very common name. We're going to talk about those names in just a moment. But the Iscariot part points to the fact that you say Ish Kariot. Ish is the word for man. He was the man from Kerioth, probably referencing a specific village down in Judea in the southern part of Canaan. Now, names and naming in the New Testament world. Fathers, oftentimes, somebody could be named after their father or signified by, Joseph ben something, Joseph, son of whatever the name of his father was. And in this regard, I suppose you could have called Jesus ben Joseph, because Joseph was his legal adopted father. No, not physical, he was born of a virgin, but he would have been known as the carpenter's son, the son of Joseph. Or he could have a religious title, maybe specifying some sort of religious designation, a political affiliation, the town he was from, like Jesus of Nazareth. We see this in places like James and John, the sons of Zebedee, or Simon the Zealot. That was his political affiliation. We would say John the Republican, or Charles the Democrat, and we don't usually use that sort of thing. Or where he was from, think about Saul of Tarsus. He's from the city of Tarsus. Now, what I'd like to note is that we have a number of names that are Jewish, so that there's a Hebrew name, but then also it goes from Jewish, when we get to the New Testament, a Greek rendition of that name, and of course we have an English translation. So that, for example, the Hebrew name Yeshua turns to Jesus when you write it in Greek with Greek letters. Greeks love to end a masculine name with a sigma, or with an S. And then we say Jesus. Remember, for Hebrew and Greek, they did not actually have the letter J. And so there's a number of languages today that don't use the letter J. Yeah, English does, and English likes to get their usage from it, and so it's inserted there. Jacob is another Hebrew name, perhaps you recognize it, or the Greek version, Jacobos. Of course, they're just transliterating it, and then that's the name Jacob. But notice when we get to the New Testament, even though we might refer to Jacob by that name, we have other disciples who had the same name, and instead of reading it as Jacobos, it's been anglicized for our English translations, and we're going to read the name James. It's the same name. Here's another one, Jehonathan. And of course, that sounds a little bit like the way we typically write it in English, but for the Old Testament, Jonathan. When we get to the New Testament, it's Johannes. And of course, we just say John. And I'm very used to that because that's my first name. You have in the Old Testament Joseph. Remember, there's no letter J, so a number of these names, our English counterpart starts with the letter J. We think of Joseph. When we get to the Greek rendition, the Greek transliteration, Greek doesn't have a Y, and so it's Joseph, and then we just have Joseph. That's pretty easy. That's not too far from its origin. Or you have in the Old Testament Miriam, a familiar woman's name. Well, it's rendered into, sometimes you actually have Miriam in the Greek text, or other times it's Marias. And remember, they don't like to end a name with a vowel. And of course, we just say Mary, a very common name for us today. Two others we want to look at. One is Yehuda. We typically type that out as Judah. Remember how that one of the sons of Jacob was named Judah, and there was a tribe of Judah. When we get to the Greek way of writing that name, they don't have the letter Y, so they have to substitute something. In this case, it's on iota. Judas, and notice again, they don't like to end a name with a vowel, so they put a sigma, an S on the end of that. And then we render that as Judas, but they are all the same name. Now, Judah, was a very common name among the Jews, but it has fallen out of practice. I don't know anybody these days who names their child Judas because of the connection with Judas Iscariot. It sort of ruined that name, and that's a shame because it's a wonderful name, means praise. And then finally, this one's more of a what's the word for it? A nickname that Jesus gave to Peter, Kephas. Sometimes when we look at the English rendition of that, we're tempted to call it Cephas, but that was a K sound, Kephas. And then, of course, notice it's not a transliteration, but actually a translation. The word Kephas is Aramaic for rock. And so when you want to say that name in Greek, you just say Petros, which is the Greek word for rock. And I suppose if we were going to be consistent, we would have translated it as Rocky, but instead we transliterate it as Peter. And I suppose that works for us as well. Now, when we come to Roman names, it's entirely different because the Romans would actually have three names. You would have what's called a praenomen, that is a first name, and then a nomen and a cognomen. The praenomen, for example, Gaius Julius Caesar. And so the first is his first name, and next he's from the Julian family, and then or from the tribe of the Julian tribe, and then from the family of Caesar. And so notice the first name is the one that he distinguishes him, and yet there weren't a lot of either first or tribal or cognomens. There were only a set number, and so we see these numbers repeated very oftentimes. Gaius Julius Caesar, of course, you know about Julius Caesar. But then when he adopted his son Octavius at his death, when they read the will, and it turned out that Octavius had been adopted, and the first thing he did is he went out and changed his name. And so we know him as Octavius, or sometimes we'll say Octavius Augustus. He changed his name. He called himself Gaius Julius Caesar. And we don't call him that because it would be quite confusing to our history books, and we would always be mixing up the two. But they had no problems with that. Here's another common name, Publius Cornelius Scipio. Of course, he was the great general who delivered the Romans in the days of the Second Punic War. But then a third one I want to mention, Lucius Sergius Paulus. And notice that last name, Paulus, we're going to see that in just a moment. It was a cognomen. It was a last name. And Lucius Sergius Paulus happens to be a well-known proconsul. He was the governor of the island of Cyprus, so let's go there. Here's the island of Cyprus off the coast of the, notice to the north you have modern-day Turkey, back then they called Anatolia, and then Syria to the east, and then the island of Cyprus, and of course the governor there was Lucius Sergius Paulus. And in Acts chapter 13 we find out that he had a sort of an advisor by the name of Elymas, but he also went by the name of Bar Jesus. Bar is Aramaic for son, so son of Jesus. Now, not the Jesus that we're familiar with, Jesus the Son of God, but rather remember that name Jesus or Yeshua. It was a very common name. It was very common in the Old Testament and still in the New Testament times. But in Acts chapter 13, we have the Apostle Paul, and he, of course, he's being referred to there as Saul of Tarsus, and he was first introduced that way, and the name Saul is used all the way up. It doesn't change at his conversion, even through his conversion, all the way up until Acts chapter 13, when Paul, actually he's Saul at the point, and he's traveling on his first missionary journey, and he comes through to Cyprus, and he travels through Cyprus, and there in Cyprus he meets Lucius Sergius Paulus. Somebody with the same last name. Remember, Paulus is always the last name. And Saul says, oh my goodness, that's my last name too. Who knows, maybe we're sort of loosely related. Now Saul was Jewish, and as far as we know, Lucius Sergius Paulus was not Jewish, but perhaps somewhere in Saul's past, his family had been adopted into a Roman family and had the same last name, and Saul starts going by his Roman name from now on, at least as recorded both in his epistles and also in the book of Acts. From now on, we begin reading not of Saul, but of Paul. Now, that didn't reflect that now I'm a Christian, so I'm going to get a Christian name. No, there was nothing non-Christian about Saul, but rather he's identifying himself with this well-known Roman. It would be a bit like somebody who maybe had the last name of Obama or Trump or Bush, and you know, I'm not trying to be political here, but you might end up saying, gee, that's my last name too. No, I'm not necessarily related to the president, but we share a little bit of an affinity. And you would be sure to mention that last name if you happen to meet that famous person. And that's what Saul does. He now begins to go by Paul. And it's interesting that after this, that Paul, formerly Saul, but now Paul, he actually, once they leave Cyprus, they go back up to Anatolia, and there they seek out, I don't know if they actually stayed with him, but they happen to go in the direction of the hometown of Lucius Sergius Paulus, who was from that part, and who knows, maybe he sent his namesake, I'm not saying they were related, but he sends somebody with the same name. He says, why don't you go check out and why don't you go tell the gospel to the folks that I know? It's my hometown. Just use your name and it will open up doors. And who knows, perhaps Paul used that to gain an entrance.